The wood is screaming. Every splintering crack of the master bedroom door echoes the sickening thud of my own ribs against the hardwood of the staircase. I am 22 years old, and I am learning that the home my mother built for us has become a coffin. Alistair's shadow looms through the frosted glass, a distorted monster fueled by high-stakes debts and a twisted sense of ownership. I drag myself upward, each inch a marathon of agony, my breath coming in shallow, jagged hitches that taste of copper. My phone lies 3 steps above me, its screen a spiderweb of dead pixels and cold light. 3% battery. The red icon flashes like a dying pulse. I have exactly enough power for one message, one lifeline thrown into the dark. If I call the police, Alistair will use the influence he bought with my mother's estate to silence me before the sirens even turn the corner. I need my best friend, the only person who knows the truth behind the locked doors of the Vale mansion. With trembling fingers smeared with dust and blood, I reach for the messaging app. My vision is blurring, the world tilting on its axis as the doorframe finally begins to give way. I don't check the contact. I don't verify the name. I just type with the frantic rhythm of the doomed, my stepdad is breaking the door. I'm on the stairs. Please help. 12 Oak Ridge. I'm so scared. I press send. The little arrow swishes away into the digital ether, and the screen flickers once before turning into a black, reflective void. I rest my forehead against the coldwood of the step, waiting for the sound of a frantic reply, a siren, or a miracle. 6 miles away, at the summit of a glass and steel monolith that pierces the Philadelphia skyline, the atmosphere is a different world entirely. The air here smells of expensive sandalwood and absolute authority. Yun Do-Hwan sits in a leather chair, his sleek black suit as sharp and cold as the blade tucked into his waistband. He is the predatory calm in a city of chaos, a man who built an empire on the ruins of those who underestimated him. His private phone, a device known to only 3 living souls, buzzes against the mahogany desk. He doesn't receive spam. He doesn't receive wrong numbers. He picks it up, his dark eye scanning the frantic plea from an unknown sender. He's breaking the door. For a second, the stillness of the penthouse shatters. Do-Hwan doesn't call the authorities. He doesn't hesitate. He stands, the city lights reflecting in eyes that have seen too much blood to be moved by anything but a debt of soul. He buttons his jacket, looks at the giant of a man standing by the door, and speaks with a finality that shakes the room. Bring the car. We're going to Oak Ridge. Kindly subscribe, like and hit the share button for more of this story. The high-rise boardroom was a tomb of glass and silence, the air thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the unspoken threat of a deal gone cold. Yun Do-Hwan sat at the head of the obsidian table, his expression as unreadable as a frozen lake. Across from him, the heads of the city's shipping unions were sweating through their tailored shirts, their eyes darting to the heavyset men standing like statues against the reinforced walls. A multi-million-dollar expansion hung in the balance, a move that would solidify Do-Hwan's grip on the eastern seaboard. His personal phone buzzed against the stone tabletop, a sharp, insistent vibration that cut through the low hum of the ventilation system. This number was a ghost, known only to a handful of people who moved in the deepest shadows. The union boss faltered in his speech, silenced by the mere tilt of Do-Hwan's head. Do-Hwan picked up the device. The screen glowed against his palm, revealing a text from an unknown local number. My stepdad is breaking the door. I'm on the stairs. Please help. 12 Oak Ridge. I'm so scared. The words were frantic, the grammar fractured by terror. To any other man in his position, it was a domestic error, a stray signal from a world they had long since outgrown. But as Do-Hwan stared at the glowing text, the glass boardroom seemed to dissolve. In its place, he saw a cramped hallway in Seoul 20 years ago. He heard the rhythmic, heavy thud of a boot against wood and the stifled, rhythmic sobbing of a woman who knew no one was coming. He felt the ghost of a scar on his own ribs, a souvenir from the night he had been too small to stop the monster in his own home. Fate didn't ask for permission, it simply arrived. He stood up, the motion so sudden and controlled that the men across from him flinched. He didn't offer an explanation or a closing statement. He simply buttoned his suit jacket, his eyes turning flat and final. "The meeting is over," he said, his voice a low, predatory rasp that brooked no argument. Boss, his right hand, a man built like a fortress, stepped forward, his hand hovering near the weapon concealed beneath his coat. "The union papers?" We were seconds away from a signature. Do-Hwan didn't look back as he crossed the room toward the private elevator. He slid the phone into his pocket, the heat of the device feeling like a brand against his thigh. "The papers can wait. The girl cannot." As the elevator doors slid shut, reflecting his calm, lethal silhouette, he looked at his lieutenant. "Bring the car." "And the heavy heat." "We're going to Oak Ridge." The master bedroom door didn't just open, it exploded. I woke to the rhythmic hum of a climate-controlled city and the scent of expensive white tea mixed with something sterile and sharp. The moonlight through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse cut across the floor like a cold, silver blade. Do-Hwan didn't sit, he stood by the glass, his silhouette a dark, immovable shape against the glittering chaos of the city below. The silence between us wasn't empty, it was heavy, filled with the unspoken weight of the world he inhabited. I watched him from the bed, my breath still shallow, still careful. "You said nothing happens without your permission," I whispered, my voice finally finding its edge. "But why me?" "You could have ignored that text. You could have let the complication resolve itself in that hallway." He turned slowly, the light catching the sharp line of his jaw and the haunting stillness in his eyes. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked toward the chair Hannah had vacated and sat, leaning forward until the shadows of the room partially masked his face. "When I was 8 years old, I lived in a house much smaller than yours," he began, his voice dropping into a low, rhythmic cadence that felt like a confession. The walls were thin enough to hear a teardrop hit the floor. "My father was a man who believed that power was best expressed through the breaking of things, mostly the woman who gave me life." He reached up, his fingers tracing a faint, jagged line beneath the collar of his sweater, a scar I hadn't seen before. "One night, he didn't stop. My mother tried to reach the phone, just like you did. She wanted to call her brother, a man who lived 3 provinces away. But she was too slow. The cord was ripped from the wall before the first digit was dialed. The air in the room seemed to vanish. I saw the ghost of that little boy in the set of his shoulders, the child who had watched a monster win because no one answered the call. "I didn't choose to help you because I am a good man, Seraphine," he said, his gaze locking onto mine with a terrifying intensity. "I am a man who has done things that would make your stepfather look like a saint. But I made a vow in that blood-stained hallway 20 years ago. If I ever heard that specific sound again, the sound of wood splintering and a woman screaming for a lifeline, I would be the one to answer." He stood up, the vulnerability of the story vanishing as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the lethal armor of the boss. "You think you've traded one dangerous man for another, and you're right. But Alistair Crow broke your ribs because he thinks you're a possession. I took you because I recognize a debt of blood when I see it." He walked toward the door, pausing as the sensor hissed open. "Rest. Tomorrow, we find out exactly how much your life is worth to the men Alistair owes." The morning light in the penthouse was cold and clinical, illuminating the sharp edges of my new reality. Hannah had left a tray of tea that remained untouched, the steam long since vanished. I managed to sit up, the fire in my ribs reduced to a dull, throbbing ache thanks to a cocktail of high-end painkillers. On the bedside table sat a heavy, black lacquer box, something I hadn't noticed the night before. A note in precise, sharp calligraphy was tucked under the lid. "My men retrieved this from the wall safe behind your mother's portrait. You should know what you are fighting for." I opened the box, and my breath hitched. Resting on a bed of velvet was my mother's sapphire pendant, the one she wore in every childhood memory I possessed. Beneath it lay her diamond wedding band and the gold watch Alistair claimed he had sold to pay for her medical expenses years ago. He hadn't sold them, he had hoarded them like a trophy hunter while I lived on coffee and art supplies. But tucked at the very bottom of the box was a folder of thick, cream-colored parchment. As I pulled it out, the weight of it felt heavier than the jewelry. These weren't just papers, they were a ledger of my own destruction. I scanned the first page, my heart stuttering. Debt obligation, Seraphine Vale. The date stretched back 3 years. Huge, impossible sums of money were listed next to the names of underground casinos and private betting rings I had never heard of. My signature was at the bottom of every page, a perfect, flowing script that looked exactly like my own, yet I knew I had never touched this pen. Alistair hadn't just stolen my inheritance, he had stolen my identity. He had been using my name as collateral for high-stakes illegal gambling with a rival syndicate known as the Iron Lotus. I wasn't just his stepdaughter, I was his insurance policy. If he couldn't pay, the debt didn't vanish, it transferred to me. The door slid open, and Do-Hwan entered. He didn't look at the jewelry. His eyes were fixed on the ledger in my shaking hands. $40 million, he said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. That is the price the Iron Lotus has placed on your head. Alistair didn't just break your ribs, Seraphine. He sold your future to men who don't care about art. I looked up at him, the sapphire pendant clutched so tightly in my palm that the metal bit into my skin. He used me. He turned me into a debt. He turned you into a target, Do-Hwan corrected, stepping into the light. And the Iron Lotus is coming to collect. They don't want the money anymore. They want the girl who legally owns the Vale estate. I looked back at the ledger, the ink blurred by a sudden, hot tear. I wasn't a girl anymore, I was a transaction. But as I looked at Do-Hwan, I realized he was the only one in the city who wasn't looking at me like a checkbook. He was looking at me like a weapon. The relative silence of the penthouse was shattered not by a sound, but by the frantic vibration of Do-Hwan's phone against the glass coffee table. He didn't have to say a word for me to know the world had shifted again. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with a sudden, lethal electricity that radiated from him as he stared at the screen. "It's your aunt, Seraphine," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "The Iron Lotus took her from her flower shop 20 minutes ago." The sapphire pendant slipped from my fingers, hitting the floor with a hollow click. Aunt Elena. She was the only person left who remembered my mother's real smile, the only one who had tried to warn me about Alistair before he cut her out of my life. My chest tightened, the bandages around my ribs feeling like a cage as the room began to spin. "They sent a video," Do-Hwan continued, his jaw tight enough to snap bone. He turned the screen toward me. It was grainy and dark, showing Elena tied to a rusted chair in a space that smelled of damp concrete and old oil. Behind her stood a man whose face was obscured by the shadows of a brimmed hat, holding a phone with a digital timer counting down from 60 minutes. The ultimatum was clear, the Iron Lotus didn't want the money Alistair had lost. They wanted the key. They wanted me to sign over the Vale estate in person at the Old River Industrial Park, or Elena would become a message sent back to Do-Hwan in pieces. "I have to go," I whispered, pushing myself off the bed despite the white-hot flare of agony in my side. "She's all I have left. I won't let her die for a debt she didn't sign." Do-Hwan stepped into my path, his height casting a long, intimidating shadow over me. "It's a kill box, Seraphine. They aren't looking for a signature, they're looking to draw me out into the open so they can eliminate the competition and take you as a trophy. If you walk into that industrial park, you aren't coming back." "Then let me go alone," I snapped, my desperation fueling a courage I didn't know I possessed. "Alistair already took my home and my body. I won't let them take her too." Do-Hwan looked at me then, really looked at me. He didn't see the victim anymore. He saw the same fire that had driven him to survive his own father's house. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw with a touch that was surprisingly grounded. I told you once that nothing happens in this city without my permission, he said, his eyes turning into flint. That includes your sacrifice. We're going to the industrial park. But we aren't going to negotiate. We're going to burn their ledger to the ground. Minutes later, we were in the back of a blacked-out SUV, the engine a low growl as we sped toward the rusted skeleton of the riverfront. I clutched my mother's pendant, realizing that the girl who sent a text to a wrong number was gone. In her place was someone who was ready to face the monsters, as long as the devil was riding shotgun. The Old River Industrial Park was a skeletal forest of rusted cranes and hollowed-out warehouses, bathed in the flickering, artificial hum of buzzing neon signs from the nearby shipyard. The air tasted of salt and diesel, a cold wind whipping through the ruins. As the black SUV ground to a halt, the headlights illuminated a dozen men standing in a loose semicircle, their shadows stretching like jagged teeth across the asphalt. In the center, tied to a rusted bollard beneath a humming transformer, was Aunt Elena. Do-Hwan stepped out of the car before it had fully settled. He didn't crouch or seek cover, he walked into the center of the kill box with the terrifying confidence of a man who had already decided how everyone in the room would die. His black suit absorbed the neon glare, making him look like a hole cut out of reality. The girl for the woman, a voice rasped from the darkness. A man stepped forward, his face scarred and his eyes bright with the fever of the Iron Lotus. And the signature for your life, Do-Hwan. It's a fair trade for 40 million in bad blood. I watched from the cracked leather seat of the SUV, my heart hammering against my fractured ribs. Do-Hwan had told me to stay put, but he didn't realize that an artist spends her life looking at the world differently. While the Iron Lotus saw a battlefield, I saw a composition. I saw the way the ancient electrical grid of the park hummed with instability. I saw the high-voltage lines feeding the massive shipyard floodlights overhead, and I saw the exposed terminal box just 3 feet from the SUV's open door. You have the signature, Do-Hwan said, his voice a low, lethal vibration that drew every eye to him. But you don't have the sense to realize you're already dead. The lead gunman raised his weapon, his finger tightening on the trigger. Kill him. I didn't wait for the muzzle flash. I lunged from the car, ignoring the white-hot scream of my lungs, and slammed the heavy iron wrench Do-Hwan's lieutenant had left behind into the exposed terminal box. The world turned white. A massive surge of redirected power tore through the grid. The shipyard floodlights didn't just turn on, they exploded into life with a blinding, 5 million candle power glare that turned the midnight docks into a midday sun. The Iron Lotus gunmen, their eyes adjusted to the shadows, screamed in pain, clutching their faces as the sudden brilliance seared their retinas. In that second of total sensory overload, Do-Hwan moved. He was a blur of motion in the white light, a ghost reclaiming the night. The sound of suppressed gunfire was lost in the roar of the overloaded transformers. I collapsed back against the car, my vision swimming, but I saw him reach Elena, his body a shield against the chaos. The tactical advantage hadn't come from a gun, it had come from the girl who knew how to change the light. The white-hot glare of the shipyard lights had turned the docks into a bleached wasteland of overexposed shadows and blinding brilliance. To the men of the Iron Lotus, it was a wall of pain that rendered their tactical training useless, but to me, it was a canvas I had spent years sketching from my bedroom window during the long, sleepless nights of my captivity. I knew every crane silhouette, every blind spot created by the towering stacks of rusted shipping containers, and the exact angle where the light failed to penetrate the deep recesses of the loading bays. Do-Hwan was a shadow in the storm, moving with a terrifying fluid grace that the screaming gunman couldn't track. He wasn't just fighting, he was harvesting. But the rival boss, a man whose name was whispered in the same breath as Executioner, had managed to retreat into the darkness of the main gantry. He held Aunt Elena as a shield, his weapon pressed to her temple, his eye shielded by the crook of his arm. "I'll kill her, Do-Hwan," he roared, his voice cracking with the desperation of a cornered animal. "I'll take her with me before I let you have this win." I pushed myself up from the asphalt, the metallic tang of blood in my mouth and the fire in my ribs forgotten. I didn't reach for a gun. I reached for the control panel of the secondary hoist, a rusted console I'd seen the dock workers use 1,000 times while I sat on the pier with my sketchbook. I didn't need to see him, I just needed to know where he had to be. I pulled the manual override, the ancient gears of the gantry crane groaning in a low, industrial scream. The massive overhead lights on the crane arm swung wide, acting like a giant, sweeping brush of light. I timed the rotation, calculating the arc as if I were blending colors on a palette. The light swept across the gantry, reflecting off the polished chrome of the boss's weapon. For a fraction of a second, he was perfectly silhouetted against the dark river, a sharp, black ink blot on a white page. Now! I screamed. Do-Hwan didn't miss. He didn't need a second chance. The crack of his rifle was the final note in the symphony of chaos. The rival boss fell back, his grip on Elena loosening as he plummeted into the black water of the Delaware. Do-Hwan reached Elena before she could hit the ground, his large frame shielding her from the remaining flickers of electrical fire. He looked back at me through the dissipating smoke and the dying hum of the overloaded grid. His face was unreadable, but for the first time, the flat, lethal coldness in his eyes was replaced by something else, a recognition. I dropped the heavy wrench, my hands finally shaking. I had spent my life observing the world, hiding behind a pencil and paper while men like Alistair and the Iron Lotus treated me like a silent background character. But tonight, I had changed the composition. I wasn't the girl in the sketch anymore, I was the hand holding the brush. The dawn that rose over the Delaware River was a pale, bruised purple, reflecting the end of a long and bloody night. The shipyard was quiet now, the hum of the overloaded transformers replaced by the rhythmic lap of water against the pier and the distant, approaching wail of sirens. But these weren't the local sirens Alistair Crow had spent years paying off. These were the sirens of a federal task force, summoned by a digital trail of gambling debts and offshore laundering that Do-Hwan's team had meticulously unmasked while the dockside war raged. Alistair stood at the edge of the pier, his expensive wool coat torn and his face a mask of pathetic, trembling disbelief. Two of Do-Hwan's men held him by the arms, forcing him to look at the wreckage of his influence. I stood beside Do-Hwan, the sapphire pendant heavy and cold against my chest, watching the man who had tried to break me turn into a hollow shell of himself. "You can't do this," Alistair hissed, his voice cracking as he looked at the approaching lights. "I have friends. I have records that could ruin half the city." Do-Hwan stepped forward, his presence as final as a closing door. He didn't use his weapon. Instead, he held up a single, black flash drive. "Your friends have already been briefed, Alistair. They've spent the last hour deciding which one of them will testify against you first to save their own skins. You aren't a man with secrets anymore. You're just a liability." He nodded to his men, who shoved Alistair toward the waiting federal agents. There would be no bail, no quiet dismissals, and no more locked doors. The law he couldn't bribe had finally arrived, and the weight of my mother's stolen legacy was the anchor that would pull him down. 6 months later, the air was different. It didn't taste of salt and diesel, but of mountain rain and the vibrant, neon energy of soul. I sat on the terrace of a studio that overlooked the Namsan Tower, the floor littered with sketches that were no longer grey and cramped. My latest canvas was a riot of color, of light breaking through darkness, of a woman who had stopped running and started leading. Do-Hwan walked onto the terrace, the morning sun catching the sharp lines of a suit that felt less like armor and more like a choice. He didn't say anything at first, he just looked at the painting, his dark eyes lingering on the bold strokes of gold I had used to define the light. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, velvet bag. He didn't offer a ring. Not yet. He pulled out a phone, the one with the shattered screen and the 3% battery that had started it all. He had it encased in a block of clear resin, a permanent reminder of a wrong number that led to the only right destination. "The exhibit opens tonight," he said, his voice a low, warm rasp. "The city is waiting to see what the girl from Oak Ridge has to say." I looked at the phone, then up at the man who had answered a stranger's prayer when the world was splintering apart. I wasn't his prisoner, and I wasn't a debt to be collected. I was Seraphine Vale, and I had found a home in the shadows of a man who knew that some doors were meant to be broken so that others could finally open. I took his hand, choosing freely, and stepped out into the light.